Welcome back to News Talk. It is years behind schedule and millions over budget. But on Saturday, the D.C. streetcar line will finally begin taking passengers. The 2.2-mile line running along H Street and Benning Road in Northeast. Joining us now, David Alpert. He's editor-in-chief of the blog Greater Washington. Always great to have you here. Always great to be able to talk with you when issues of transit, mobility, and what sort of communities we're going to have is on the agenda, as it is today. This thing has been an amazing drama. It goes back, I think, 4 different mayors in the district, going back to Williams, I guess. Williams, Fenty, Gray, and now Mayor Bowser will have the honor, diminished though it might be a little bit by circumstance, of cutting the ribbon and launching this final step in the process of getting streetcar up and running.
That's right, and actually initial planning for the streetcar, at least the idea of it, goes back to the Barry administration as well, where in 1985, his administration put out a transportation plan that suggested it. As you said, the actual work on it began with Mayor Williams and has taken quite some time.
There's a lot of bad to rehash, and I want to get to some of that in a moment. First, let's talk about why this project came about and what the hope for it is.
There are a few reasons that cities in many cities around the country are trying to build streetcars. And if you go to a lot of cities in Europe, they have them everywhere, and people take them and they work very well. There are a few things that can be valuable. One is that they actually have a higher capacity than buses because they can be longer. The maintenance cost over time can be better because by running on rails, there's a little bit less of that. In a lot of cities that do them successfully, though, as well, they will have things like dedicated lanes to make sure that they also can go around some of the higher traffic trouble spots. And that's something that D.C. has debated and should have on some of the line in the future, but not the part that's being opened on Saturday.
Why this location? Does this location excite and improve as much as it did when it was lines on a page all those years ago?
There's a lot of good reason to have to continue to try to improve transit on H Street. H Street Northeast and Benning Road is one of the major commercial corridors of D.C. that was decimated by the 1968 riots. Obviously, it's been a long time since then, and it's come back quite a bit. But it's also one of the corridors that does not have a metro line on it, as compared to, let's say, 14th Street Northwest, where because of the U Street Metro and the Columbia Heights Metro, that's really helped bring new businesses to that street. And a lot of people feel actually that just the promise of the streetcar helped encourage some businesses to get an early start on H Street, get property owners to sort of stop sitting around and waiting to redevelop and get going.
That's a great point that you make. In some ways, there's no better way to feel good about an area's future than to see this sort of investment, particularly at a time when we're in a really dramatic, almost unprecedented period where young people, unlike from my generation, I literally got my driver's license on my 17th birthday because that was the earliest I could do it. I couldn't do it the day before. Got up the next day, my dad took me to get my driver's license, and I was not unusual. I mean, in my day, if there was any way you could get your hands on a steering wheel, yours or someone else's, you did it. You know why you didn't waste any time in terms of getting your license. We're in a much different time today, particularly in urban areas where the transportation options generally are fairly plentiful. So you make a great point about how just the notion that it was coming was signaled good things to come for the area.
That's right, and a lot of millennials, as you said, are driving in lower numbers. Certainly some are. There have been research that says, well, they're not, it's not none of them, but fewer are driving because people want to have other options, and they can live in urban areas with not just buses and trains, but also Uber and Car2Go and Zipcar and so forth as ways to not have to incur the fairly high expense of owning a car. As far as H Street, the X2 bus has been one of the highest ridership lines in the city. It's I think in the top 5, and this is an opportunity to add capacity, add service over time, and increase the accessibility of H Street.
Phone lines open as we talk with David Alpert. He's with Greater Washington. We're talking primarily about the H Street Benning Road streetcar line that finally at long last opens on Saturday, but we want to talk about transit and mobility generally. Ike Leggett is trying to get bus rapid transit up and running. This will take a long time to be sure, but Mike Leggett in Montgomery County is trying to get a bus rapid transit conversation started there, and we know what happened with Arlington and their decision to pull the plug on a streetcar program that had been many years in the making. So this segment and next, for those of you watching the 60-minute version of the program, we're talking with David Alpert, and we would love to include you in the conversation. Our number is 703-387-1020. Questions, comments, thoughts, and suggestions about transit and mobility and this controversial and trouble-plagued streetcar program. We invite your calls, and we'll go to the phones as your calls come in at 703-387-1020. What's your understanding about why this was such a botch job?
There were, we could spend probably the entire segment listing all the reasons, but to be very brief, there's a few things. One is that D.C. tried to get a streetcar in a place that the government at the time, that was under, I think, the Williams administration, thought it would be as easy as possible. There was an old rail line in Anacostia, so they bought some streetcars with the hopes of running them on that line. The tracks were there in the ground. It's still owned by CSX. But then it turned out they couldn't do it. Then they decided to try to move it to H Street. Then they had an idea that they would be able to put the maintenance facility underneath the bridge where H Street goes over the Amtrak railroad tracks. There's a tunnel under those tracks that has not been used for a long time. Then Amtrak said, no, we want to use that for a concourse in the future. So there were a number of times that maybe the folks who were working on it were too optimistic about their ability to do something. Maybe they didn't do all of the research they needed to do, but they were also trying to get the project going, and in a way they were trying to get it going with less cost, not make it a long process, not make it a really expensive process, but it sort of didn't work out, and so then we ended up where we were today. And then there was a period of a few years where unfortunately DDOT just did a very bad job of communicating and planning it and construction, where every year they would say, we're about to open it, and then in November, December, it would become clear that they couldn't. And then the next year that repeated.
Someone could write a book about all this, and who knows, perhaps they will. A lot to tell in a very complicated story. We're talking with David Alpert of Greater Washington. More of our conversation on air and online. Our blog is always tons of great video there. We invite you to check us out online at news8newstalk.com. A break here, back with more of the show right after this.